A lot of people are drawn to Alaska for the same reason: distance. Not just distance from cities or noise or traffic, but distance from everything. From schedules, from crowded spaces, from the feeling that someone is always nearby. Alaska has a reputation for giving people room to breathe. Endless forests, miles of mountains, rivers that stretch farther than you can see. It's the kind of place where you can walk for hours and never cross another human being. For some people, that kind of silence feels peaceful. But the deeper you go into the wilderness, the more you start to understand something about that silence. It isn't just quiet, it's empty. Once you're far enough from towns, from roads, from the occasional passing truck or distant cabin light, you start to realize how exposed you really are. Out there, help isn't a phone call away. Sometimes it isn't even a day away. In parts of Alaska, you can be hundreds of miles from the nearest person without realizing it. Most of the time, nothing happens. But every once in a while, someone notices something that doesn't quite fit. A sound that doesn't match the environment. Movement where nothing should be moving. Or that quiet, uncomfortable feeling that someone might be nearby. Even though the land around you is supposed to be completely empty. The strange part is that these moments rarely feel dramatic when they happen. Most people don't panic. At first they rationalize it. Remember one person explaining it like this: "At first I told myself it was just the wind. But then something else happened." And that's when they realized something didn't add up. Once they noticed it, they couldn't unnotice it. The 3 stories in this video all come from people who thought they were completely alone in the Alaskan wilderness. But the worst part about what happened to them isn't what they saw. It's what they were never able to explain afterward. Story 1, the campsite that wasn't empty a few years ago. I decided to take a solo backpacking trip through a section of a national park in Alaska that most people don't bother with. It's not one of the well-known trails that show up on travel blogs or tourism videos. The area is huge, mostly untouched, and from what I'd read, foot traffic there is extremely low. That was actually the main reason I picked it. I'd done plenty of hiking before, but that trip was specifically about getting away from people. Wanted quiet. No traffic, no cell service, no constant background noise. Just a few days in the wilderness, with nothing but a pack and a trail map. The hike-in started early in the morning. The trailhead itself was already pretty remote, about 2 hours from the nearest small town. When I got there, the parking area only had 2 other vehicles, and judging by the dust on them, they'd probably been there for a while. Once I started walking, it didn't take long for the outside world to disappear. The trail moved through thick forest, sometimes opening up to wide valleys where you could see mountains stretching out in every direction. It was the kind of place where the land feels almost too big to process. You could stand still and look around and not see a single sign of civilization. For most of the day, I didn't encounter another person. Not on the trail, not in the distance, not even a glimpse of movement through the trees. Just wind moving through branches and the occasional bird overhead. Honestly, that's exactly what I wanted. By late afternoon, I started thinking about where I'd stop for the night. The sun was still up, but in Alaska, it's easy to lose track of time, and I didn't want to be setting up camp in the dark. Eventually, the trail curved down toward a narrow river that cut through a clearing in the trees. It was one of those places that almost feels designed for camping. Flat ground, enough open space to see around you, and the sound of water moving steadily over rocks. I dropped my pack there and spent a few minutes just standing by the river, listening. The water was loud enough to cover most other sounds, but not so loud that it felt overwhelming. The air had that late summer chill starting to creep in, and the forest around the clearing looked calm and still. It felt like the perfect place to stop. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, close. Enough to the trees for a little wind protection, but far enough away that nothing could icily approach without being visible. After that, I used my small stove to heat up some food and sat on a rock near the river while I ate. The entire time, the place felt completely empty. No voices in the distance. No other tents. No sign that anyone had been there recently. Even the ground around the clearing didn't show obvious footprints or fire pits. Just untouched dirt and grass. I remember thinking how strange it was to be somewhere that quiet. In most parks, you at least hear people eventually. It's distant hikers, someone setting up camp, maybe a conversation carrying across the trees. But there was none of that. Just the river and the wind moving gently through the branches. And honestly, that kind of isolation felt good at first. There's something relaxing about knowing you're truly alone for a while. No interruptions, no distractions, just the simple routine of camping in the middle of nowhere. After I finished eating, I cleaned up my gear and walked a short distance along the edge of the clearing to stretch my legs. The light was starting to fade a little, and the forest was slowly shifting into that quieter evening atmosphere. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have the place completely to myself. At the time, I had absolutely no reason to think otherwise. As the evening started settling in, the temperature dropped just enough that you could feel it in the air. That kind of slow cooling that happens in the wilderness when the sun dips behind the trees. I zipped up my jacket, packed away the last of my gear, and sat near the entrance of my tent for a while, just listening to the river. At first, everything still felt normal. The water was moving steadily over rocks, and occasionally the wind would push through the tops of the trees. It was the kind of quiet you expect when you're camping somewhere remote. But after a while, I started noticing something strange about the silence around the clearing. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. Normally when you're out in the woods, even late at night, there are small background sounds. Insects buzzing, birds shifting around in the trees, maybe the distant movement of small animals in the brush. Those little noises form this constant layer of sound that you almost stop noticing after a while. But sitting there by the river, I realized I couldn't hear any of that. No insects, no birds, nothing moving through the trees. It's just the river and the occasional breeze. At first, I didn't think much about it. Figured maybe it was just the temperature dropping or the time of year. Late summer in Alaska can cool off quickly once the sun starts fading, and sometimes that changes the way wildlife moves around. So I tried not to read too much into it. Still, the longer I sat there, the more the quiet started feeling. Different. Not peaceful. Not relaxing. Just unusually complete. I remember scanning the tree line a few times without really thinking about why. The clearing was open enough that I could see the edge of the forest clearly. But beyond those first few rows of trees, everything just blended into darker shadows. The river kept moving, steady and predictable. But the forest itself felt still, too still. A kind of stillness where it almost feels like the woods are holding their breath. Eventually I told myself I was probably just overthinking it. When you're alone in a place that quiet, your brain starts paying attention to details it normally ignores. So I shrugged it off, climbed into my tent, and zipped the door shut. At the time, I honestly believed it was just my imagination adjusting to the silence. I'm not exactly sure what time it was when the first sound woke me up. It must have been late because the clearing outside the tent was completely dark. The only light coming through the thin fabric was the faint glow of the moon somewhere above the trees. At first, I didn't even move. I just lay there inside the sleeping bag, half awake, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it again, a single step. Not loud, not crashing through brush or snapping branches like you might expect from an animal moving through the woods. It was slower than that. Careful. The kind of sound that happens when something puts its weight down deliberately on the forest floor. It came from somewhere beyond the clearing, maybe 20 or 30 yards out in the trees. My first thought was simple enough. Moose are common in that area, and they move quietly when they want to. Bears too. When you camp in Alaska, you expect that kind of thing. Wildlife wandering through the area at night isn't unusual. So I stayed still and listened. For a while there was nothing, just the river again. I rolled slightly onto one elbow and reached for the small flashlight I kept beside my sleeping bag. When I clicked it on and pointed it toward the tent wall, the beam lit up the inside of the fabric. Then I slowly aimed the light toward the door of the tent. The moment I shifted the beam toward the tree line, the sound stopped. Completely. I held the light there for a few seconds, waiting for another step or some movement through the brush. Nothing happened. No rustling leaves, no heavy breathing from a large animal, no snapping branches. Just the river moving through the darkness. Eventually, I switched the flashlight off again and laid back down, telling myself it had probably been an animal passing through the forest. Maybe it heard me moving in the tent and wandered off. That explanation made sense. At least it did for a minute or two. Then the sound came back. Another slow step, this time a little closer. Again I froze and listened. The step was followed by a long pause, like whatever was out there had stopped to listen. I grabbed the flashlight again and pointed it toward the trees. And once again, The moment the beam touched the tent door, the sound stopped completely. That pattern repeated itself twice more, a single slow step somewhere out in the trees, followed by silence the moment I moved or aimed the light outside. After the third time, I stayed still for a long moment in the dark, trying to think it through. Animals don't usually behave like that. A moose walking through the woods doesn't take one step and then wait several minutes before taking another. Bears move differently too. Even when they're quiet, you still hear some kind of natural movement through the brush. But whatever was out there wasn't moving like that. It was slow, careful, almost deliberate. And that's when the thought crossed my mind for the first time. Something about those footsteps wasn't behaving like an animal. For a while after that, I stayed completely still inside the tent, listening. At first, there was nothing again. It's just the steady sound of the river and the occasional faint breeze moving through the tops of the trees. I started wondering if maybe I had imagined part of it. When you're half asleep, your brain can turn small sounds into something bigger than they actually are. But then it happened again. Another step. The sound came from roughly the same direction as before, somewhere out in the trees beyond the clearing. Not close enough to be right outside the tent, but definitely closer than the first time I'd heard it. Just one step, then silence. I held my breath without realizing it, waiting for something else to follow. Branches snapping, leaves shifting, some kind of movement that would tell me an animal was walking through the forest. Nothing came. After maybe 30 seconds, I slowly turned my head toward the tent door again and picked up the flashlight. I hesitated for a moment before turning it on, almost like I didn't want to interrupt whatever was happening out there. Eventually, I clicked it on and aimed it toward the entrance. The beam hit the tent wall, then the zipper line, and finally the outline of the door. I didn't open it right away. I just held the light there and listened. No more footsteps, no rustling, nothing. After another minute, I turned the flashlight off again and set it beside my sleeping bag. About 5 minutes passed. Then another single step came from the trees. The exact same pattern as before. One slow, deliberate movement somewhere beyond the clearing, followed by complete silence. That's when I started paying closer attention to the timing. Every time I moved or reached for the light, the sound stopped. Every time I stayed still long enough, another step eventually followed. It wasn't quick. Sometimes several minutes passed between sounds. But over the next hour, the pattern repeated itself enough times that it became impossible to ignore, step, pause, silence, another step, then nothing again. I tried explaining it to myself in the simplest way possible. Maybe another camper had come through the area after dark and was trying to find a place to set up nearby. That would make sense. People sometimes hike later than they should and end up looking for a campsite in the dark. But the more I thought about that explanation, the less comfortable it felt. Anyone camping in Alaska knows one basic rule. If you're moving through the woods at night and you come near someone's campsite, you announce yourself. Loudly, you call out, you make noise, you make it clear you're human. You do that because the last thing anyone wants in bear country is to surprise someone in the dark. But whoever or whatever was out there hadn't said a word. No voice, no flashlight beam moving through the trees. Just slow, careful footsteps, peering one at a time in the darkness. And the longer it continued, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that those steps weren't random. They felt controlled, almost like something was moving through the forest, one careful step at a time, stopping every time it thought I might be paying attention. At some point, I must have drifted halfway towards sleep again because the next sound felt closer than the ones before it. It wasn't a footstep this time. It was softer than that. A slow shifting noise like something brushing lightly against grass or dirt. It's not loud enough to be obvious, but close enough that I could tell it wasn't coming from deep in the forest anymore. This sound was inside the clearing. My eyes opened immediately. For a few seconds, I didn't move at all. I just listened, trying to figure out where exactly it was coming from. The river was still running steadily nearby, but this sound was different. It was slower, careful, like something moving its weight from one place to another. Then it stopped. I stayed perfectly still inside the sleeping bag, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. My brain was working through possibilities again. Maybe a moose had wandered into the clearing. They can move quietly when they want to, especially on soft ground. But moose are big animals. When they move around a campsite, you usually hear more than one small shift. Branches, breathing, something. This had been one slow movement, then silence again. I slowly reached over and picked up the flashlight. This time I didn't hesitate. I clicked it on immediately and aimed it straight toward the door of the tent. The beam lit the thin fabric in front of me. I unzipped the door just a few inches and pushed the light through the opening. The clearing looked exactly the same as it had earlier that evening. The river moving quietly through the rocks. It's the same dark line of trees surrounding the open space. Nothing standing there, nothing moving. I swept the beam slowly from left to right, letting the light pass across the ground and the edge of the forest. Every tree looked still. Every shadow stayed exactly where it should. Eventually, I stepped outside the tent. The air was colder now, and the clearing felt larger at night than it had during the day. I held the flashlight out in front of me and walked a few steps away from the tent, scanning the tree line carefully. Still nothing. No animal shapes. No movement between the trunks. Just trees and darkness stretching away from the edge of the clearing. For a moment, I felt a little ridiculous standing there. The place looked completely empty. Quiet in the same calm way it had been earlier. I told myself again that it had probably been an animal passing through, and that the river noise was making it hard to hear clearly. So I went back into the tent and zipped the door shut. But after that, something about the clearing felt different. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore. It felt attentive. Like the forest around the campsite wasn't empty. Like something out there had simply stopped moving once it realized the light was on. I laid there for a long time after that, staring at the dark tent ceiling again, waiting. Because at that point, I had a strange feeling that whatever had been moving around the clearing hadn't actually left. It was just being careful. And for the first time that night, I started to get the uncomfortable sense that someone might be watching the campsite. Without wanting to be seen, I don't know how long I stayed awake after that. Time feels strange when you're lying in a dark tent listening for sounds that may or may not happen. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been an hour. At some point, I stopped trying to keep track. Just lay there, staring into the darkness, letting my ears do most of the work. Nothing moved for a long while. The river kept flowing, steady and unchanged, and the forest beyond the clearing stayed completely still. Eventually, the tension in my shoulders started to fade a little. My brain kept returning to the same explanation. Probably an animal. Maybe a curious one that wandered through the clearing and moved on. That made sense. It was the simplest explanation. And when you're alone somewhere that remote, simple explanations are the ones you want. I was just starting to relax again when I heard it. It was quiet, but unmistakable. A cough. Not the rough snort of a deer. Not the low grunt of a bear. A short, dry human cough coming from somewhere beyond the trees. The moment it happened, every muscle in my body went tight. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a second or two, because there are some sounds you simply recognize immediately. That was a person, out there in the woods. The strange part was how normal the sound was. It wasn't loud or aggressive or trying to get my attention. It sounded exactly like the kind of cough someone makes when they're trying to clear their throat quietly. Which meant one thing. Whoever made that sound had probably been standing out there for a while, listening. The realization hit me slowly but clearly. All those careful footsteps, the movement around the clearing, the way the sound stopped whenever I moved. That hadn't been an animal. Someone had been out there the entire time. For a few seconds, I stayed completely still inside the tent, trying to decide what to do. Part of me thought maybe if I stayed quiet, whoever it was would just move on. But the silence after that cough felt heavier than anything earlier in the night. So finally I raised my voice. Not shouting, just loud enough to carry across the clearing. "Hey," I said. The word sounded strange in the open air, almost too loud after hours of quiet. Is someone out there? For a moment, I expected to hear an answer. Maybe another camper who had wandered off trail. Maybe someone who had been trying not to disturb my campsite. But the forest didn't respond. No voice, no movement, no footsteps retreating through the brush. Nothing. The entire clearing went silent again. Even the wind through the trees seemed to stop for a moment. I waited there, listening carefully, expecting at least some sign that whoever was out there had heard me. But the woods stayed completely still. And somehow that silence felt worse than the cough itself, because if someone had been standing out there in the dark only seconds earlier, there was no way they hadn't heard me speak. And yet they chose not to answer. After a few minutes of waiting for a response that never came, I slowly lowered my voice and stopped calling out. The forest remained completely silent. At that point, my mind started doing what it naturally does when something unsettling happens in a place where you're alone. It began trying to smooth the situation out with explanations that felt less threatening. The most obvious one was simple enough. Another hiker. Even though the area didn't see much traffic, it wasn't impossible that someone else had wandered through after dark. Maybe they were looking for a campsite of their own. Maybe they'd heard me moving around earlier and decided to keep their distance. Some people hike specifically to avoid interacting with others. That happens more often than people think. I told myself maybe the person out there had just coughed without realizing how clearly it would carry across the clearing. Once they heard my voice, maybe they decided they didn't want to deal with an awkward late-night conversation with a stranger. Maybe they just quietly moved off into the forest. That explanation felt reasonable enough. There were also other possibilities. Someone camping illegally in a protected area might not want to draw attention to themselves. Or someone might simply be uncomfortable announcing their presence to a lone camper in the middle of the night. The more I thought about it, the more I tried to settle into that idea. Just another person passing through. Nothing strange, nothing threatening. Eventually, the adrenaline that had been keeping me awake started fading. The tension in my chest loosened little by little, and the exhaustion from the long hike earlier in the day began catching up with me again. I stayed awake for a while longer, listening carefully, expecting to hear footsteps moving away from the clearing. But the woods stayed quiet. And after some time, my body finally gave in to the fatigue. At some point during that silence, without hearing anything else from the forest, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was the light. Sunlight was already filtering through the trees and hitting the side of the tent. For a few seconds, I just lay there listening again, the way I had most of the night. The river was still moving nearby, steady and familiar. And the forest had returned to its normal daytime sounds. Birds. Wind moving gently through branches. Everything that had been missing the night before. For a moment, the events of the night felt distant. It's almost like something I had exaggerated in my own head because of the darkness and the isolation. Morning has a way of doing that. It makes everything feel more explainable. Eventually, I unzipped the tent door and stepped outside. The clearing looked exactly the same as it had the evening before. Sunlight on the grass, the river cutting quietly through the rocks, trees standing still around the edge of the open space. Nothing out of place, at least not at first. I stretched a little and walked a few steps away from the tent, scanning the tree line the same way I had the night before. No movement. No people. No sign that anyone else had been nearby. But when I turned back toward the tent, something on the ground caught my attention. Footprints. They were easy to miss at first, because the soil in that clearing was firm. But once I noticed them, I could see the pattern clearly. Boot prints pressed into the dirt and grass, circling slowly around the outside of my campsite. I walked closer and crouched down. They were fresh. The edges of the impressions were still sharp, not softened by wind or moisture. Whoever made them had passed through recently, probably during the night. I followed them carefully with my eyes. The trail of prints came from the direction of the forest, crossed into the clearing, and then formed a slow loop around the tent. Not a straight line, not someone passing through quickly. A circle. The path moved around the entire campsite, step by step, never getting too close, but never straying far either. At one point, the prints came within maybe 6 or 7 feet of where my head had been inside the tent. Close enough that if the person had spoken at normal volume, I would have heard them clearly. I stood there for a long moment just looking at them. Then I tried to follow the tracks farther. Eventually, the prints led back toward the edge of the forest. I walked slowly in that direction, expecting to see them continue deeper between the trees. But they didn't. Right near the tree line, the last clear print simply ended. Beyond that point, the ground was covered with pine needles and roots. The kind of surface that doesn't hold impressions very well. If someone continued walking there, it would be hard to see. Still, I looked for a long time. No second set of tracks. No sign of another campsite nearby. There's no trail leading out of the clearing. It's just those boot prints appearing from the woods, circling my tent in the middle of the night, and then disappearing back into the forest. I packed up my gear not long after that. The hike out was quiet, and I didn't encounter anyone the entire way back to the trailhead. Even when I checked the parking area later, there were no new vehicles that hadn't been there the day before. I still spend time outdoors. I still hike. But ever since that trip, I've changed one small habit. I don't camp alone in Alaska anymore. Transition. One thing people don't always realize about being in places like Alaska is how differently your mind processes things when you're far away from everything familiar. In cities, strange sounds usually have simple explanations. A door closing somewhere down the hall, someone walking past your apartment, a car moving down the street. Even if something catches your attention for a moment, there are usually enough people and background noise around that your brain fills in the gaps quickly. But in the wilderness, there are fewer explanations available, and the silence makes every small detail feel bigger than it really is. When you're somewhere remote, you notice things you normally wouldn't. A branch snapping somewhere far off, sound that seems slightly out of place, shadow shifting between trees where nothing should be moving. Most of the time, there's a logical reason for it. But when you're alone and the nearest person might be miles away, those explanations can take longer to find. Alaska also has a way of disorienting people without them realizing it. Trails can stretch farther than they look on a map. Terrain changes quickly. Landmarks start blending together after a few hours of walking. The next story actually began as something simple. It's just a routine day trip someone expected to finish before sunset. But sometimes in Alaska, the moment you realize you're lost isn't the moment things stop making sense. It's the moment they start. Story 2. Something was following the trail a few summers ago. I spent a season working near a small town in Alaska, doing wildlife photography. It wasn't anything glamorous, mostly freelance work for outdoor magazines and stock photo libraries, but it gave me a reason to spend long days out in the wilderness with a camera, which was exactly what I wanted. The town itself was small enough that everyone seemed to know each other. A few stores, a gas station, a couple of gravel roads leading out toward forest and open land. Once you drove 15 or 20 minutes away from it, the landscape opened up into the kind of wilderness Alaska is known for. Dense trees, rolling hills, rivers cutting through the terrain. There were a handful of trails around the area, most of them used occasionally by hunters or locals who knew the land well. One of those trails started just outside town and wound through a long stretch of forest before eventually climbing into higher terrain. It wasn't completely abandoned, but it definitely didn't see a lot of regular traffic. That's why I liked it. When you're doing wildlife photography, crowds are the worst thing you can encounter. Animals disappear the moment they hear too much movement or human voices. Quiet places are where the best opportunities happen. I'd walked that trail a couple of times before without seeing anyone else out there. The path was narrow, but clearly marked, mostly just a strip of packed earth running through trees and brush. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd easily lose your direction. So one morning I packed my camera gear, filled a small day pack with water and snacks, and drove out there again. The weather was perfect for photography. Light clouds moving slowly across the sky, soft sunlight filtering through the trees, just enough breeze to keep the air cool. When I stepped onto the trail, the forest smelled like damp earth and pine needles. The first couple of miles were completely uneventful, which, honestly, is a good thing when you're trying to photograph wildlife. I moved slowly, stopping every so often to take pictures of landscapes or interesting details in the environment. Moss growing along fallen logs, sunlight hitting patches of ground between the trees. Eventually, I spotted a small group of birds moving through the branches overhead and spent about 20 minutes trying to get a clear shot of them. After that, I continued farther down the trail, occasionally stepping off the path to get different camera angles. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. That's not unusual in places like that. Some areas of wilderness just have a calmer atmosphere depending on the terrain and the time of day. The trees grew thicker along that part of the trail, and the ground was covered in soft layers of pine needles that muted footsteps. I remember checking my watch at one point and realizing I'd already been walking for several hours. But I wasn't worried. The trail was straightforward and I had plenty of daylight left. My plan was simple. Keep moving until mid-afternoon, then turn around and head back to the car before evening. At the time, everything felt normal. It's a kind of quiet, routine day that happens when you spend time alone in nature. No rush, no pressure. Just walking slowly through the forest with a camera. Every once in a while, I'd stop and listen. Wind moving gently through the trees, birds calling somewhere farther away, the occasional rustle of small animals moving through brush. Those were the kinds of sounds you expect to hear in a place like that, and for most of the day, that's all there was. No other hikers, no distant voices, no signs that anyone else was using the trail that day. It's just the path stretching forward between the trees, and the steady feeling that I had the entire forest to myself. Eventually, the trail curved around a shallow hillside where the trees opened up slightly. From there, you could see deeper into the forest ahead, long rows of trunks fading into the distance. I stopped there for a moment, adjusting my camera lens and taking a few photographs of the light filtering down between the branches. It was the kind of quiet moment that photographers looked for. Stillness, balance, nothing unexpected. At least that's how it seemed at the time, because not long after that, something small happened on the trail behind me. At first, it didn't seem important enough to think twice about. By the time I decided to head back, the light had started changing in that subtle way it does. Late in the afternoon, the sun wasn't close to setting yet, but it had dipped low enough that the shadows between the trees were getting longer. For photography, that's usually a good time of day. The light softens, the colors become deeper, and everything looks a little more dramatic. But it's also the time when you start paying more attention to how far you are from the trailhead. So I turned around and began walking back the way I'd come. At first, nothing felt different. The trail was still easy to follow, and the forest had the same quiet rhythm it had most of the day. My footsteps made soft sounds against the dirt and pine needles as I moved along. After maybe 10 minutes, I noticed the first small thing that seemed out of place. One of the low branches along the side of the trail was bent downward. It wasn't snapped or broken, just pushed aside slightly like something had brushed past it recently. That kind of thing isn't unusual in the wilderness. Animals cross trails all the time. Still, I paused for a second and looked at it. When I'd walked through earlier, I was carrying a camera in my hands and paying close attention to the ground and the trees around me. I would have remembered brushing into a branch like that, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a deer had crossed the trail after I passed through, so I kept walking. A few minutes later, I noticed something else. In a patch of softer dirt near the edge of the path, there were footprints. Not very deep ones, but clear enough that the shape was easy to see. Boot prints. They were pointed in the same direction I was walking. At first, that didn't seem strange either. It just meant someone else had come down the trail sometime after I had. That happens on hiking paths all the time. But the more I thought about it, the more something about it didn't quite fit. Earlier that day, I had been paying attention to the ground while taking photos. If those prints had been there before, I probably would have noticed them. Instead, they looked fresh, like they'd been made not long ago. I crouched down for a moment and studied one of them. The edges of the impression were still defined, not filled in with dust or pine needles yet. Someone had walked through here fairly recently, which meant another hiker must have entered the trail after me. That explanation made sense. The trail might have been quiet most days, but it wasn't completely abandoned. Someone else could have started their hike later in the afternoon and caught up to where I'd been exploring. Still, I looked ahead along the path instinctively, expecting to see a person somewhere farther down the trail. There was no one there. It's just the narrow strip of dirt winding through the trees. The longer I stared down the path, the more I realized something else. The forest had gone unusually quiet again. The birds I'd been hearing earlier were gone. The wind had faded. And suddenly the only sound left was the soft rhythm of my own footsteps as I started walking again. I had just started walking again after studying the footprints when it happened. Behind me, somewhere along the trail I had just come from, a twig snapped. It was a small sound, but in a quiet forest like that it stood out immediately. It's a kind of sharp, dry crack that only happens when something puts weight on a branch lying across the ground. My first reaction was simple. Someone else was on the trail. That explanation made sense right away. I had already seen the fresh footprints earlier, so hearing someone moving behind me wasn't exactly surprising. So I turned around, expecting to see another hiker coming down the path. Maybe someone who had started later in the afternoon and was catching up. But when I looked back, the trail behind me was completely empty. No one walking there. No movement between the trees. Just the narrow strip of dirt winding quietly through the forest. Exactly the way it had looked every other time I had turned around. For a moment I stood there waiting. If someone had just stepped on a twig, They should have been close enough to see by now. But nothing appeared. The trees stayed perfectly still. The forest went quiet again. Eventually, I told myself it was probably just an animal moving through the brush beside the trail. Something small enough to stay hidden, but heavy enough to break a dry branch. Still, I lingered for a few seconds longer before turning forward again. Because the strange part wasn't the sound itself, it was how clearly it had come from the trail behind me. And yet when I looked back, there had been absolutely no one there. I stood there for a moment longer after that first sound, staring down the trail behind me. Nothing moved. The path curved slightly through the trees, but the ground was clear enough that I should have seen someone if they were walking there. No shifting branches, no movement between trunks, no person stepping out from behind a bend in the trail. Eventually, I turned back around and started walking again. At first I told myself it had probably been a small animal. Squirrels, birds, even rabbits can snap twigs when they move through the brush. When you're walking through the woods, you hear those kinds of noises all the time. But maybe 30 seconds later, I heard another sound behind me. This one was softer, a faint crunch, like gravel shifting under someone's weight. I slowed down instinctively. The sound stopped. I took 2 more steps. Nothing. Then another light disturbance came from somewhere off to the side of the trail. Not loud enough to be obvious, but clear enough that it didn't blend in with the normal background noise of the forest. I turned around again. The trail behind me was empty. Just the narrow dirt path stretching back through rows of trees, fading into darker patches of forest farther away. No person walking there, no animal crossing the trail, nothing at all. I waited a few seconds, scanning the brush on both sides of the path. Still nothing. Eventually I told myself I was probably just being overly aware of small sounds. When you're alone in the woods, every little noise can seem bigger than it really is. So I kept moving. For the next mile or so, the same pattern kept repeating. I would walk for a minute or two, listening to the quiet forest around me. Then somewhere behind me, a small disturbance would happen. A twig snapping, leaves shifting lightly, gravel crunching under something that sounded almost like a careful step. Every time I heard it, I would stop and turn around. Every time I turned around, the trail behind me was empty. No one standing there. No animal darting across the path. It's just the still forest and the fading light filtering between the trees. At one point, I even walked several steps backward along the trail, trying to catch whatever was making the sound before it disappeared again. But nothing revealed itself. The disturbances weren't constant either. Sometimes several minutes would pass with nothing unusual at all. Long enough that I would convince myself I'd imagined the previous sound, then another small movement would happen somewhere behind me. Not loud, just enough to make me stop again. At first it was easy to dismiss. Animals move through the forest constantly. The woods are never completely still. But the strange part was the timing. The sounds almost always happened when I was walking. They almost always stopped the moment I turned around. I started paying closer attention to that pattern. I'd walk 10 or 15 steps, then pause suddenly without warning. Sometimes I'd spin around quickly instead of turning slowly. Each time I did, the forest stayed perfectly still. No delayed movement. No animal running away through the brush. Just silence. Eventually I noticed something else. The sounds behind me weren't random. They were spaced out in a way that almost felt like they were matching my pace. If I walked slowly, the disturbances happened slowly. If I sped up, they seemed to happen a little more frequently. At one point, I stopped walking entirely and stood there on the trail for almost 30 seconds. Nothing happened. Then I started walking again. Maybe 5 or 6 steps later, I heard another faint crunch of gravel behind me. I turned around immediately. The trail was empty again. That was the moment when the comfortable explanation started slipping a little. Animals don't move like that. They don't take one careful step every time a person walks forward and then freeze the moment that person turns around. Standing there on the trail with the forest closing in around me and the lights slowly fading between the trees, I remember thinking something very clearly. This is where things stop making sense. After that realization, I didn't start running or anything dramatic like that. I just kept walking. But I started paying much closer attention to everything happening around me. The light in the forest had dropped another level by then. The sun was still somewhere above the tree line, but most of the trail had fallen into that dim gray shade that happens when tall trees block the last direct sunlight. It made the path feel narrower somehow, like the forest was pressing closer on both sides. For a little while the woods were quiet again. No snapping twigs, no shifting gravel, just the sound of my own boots against the trail. I started thinking maybe whatever had been moving behind me had finally turned off somewhere into the trees. Maybe an animal had simply lost interest and wandered away. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer. A distinct crunch of gravel somewhere behind me on the trail, not far away, maybe 20 or 30 feet. The sound was clear enough that I stopped walking immediately. The moment my foot paused mid-step, the forest went completely still again. No second step followed, no rustling branches, just silence. I slowly turned around. The trail behind me stretched out between the trees exactly the way it had every other time I'd looked back. Dirt path, patches of gravel, tree trunks standing quietly along both sides, no person standing there. No animal moving through the brush. But the strange part wasn't just the sound itself anymore. It was how close it seemed. Before, the noises had been farther back in the woods, distant enough that they could easily have come from something moving off the trail. Now it felt like whatever had made that sound had stepped directly onto the path behind me. I stood there for a while, watching the empty trail. Eventually I turned forward again and started walking. 10 steps, nothing. Then another faint disturbance came from somewhere behind me again. Not loud, just a slow shift, like weight settling onto loose gravel. I stopped again. Silence. At that point, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Sounds weren't random anymore. They were following me. Every time I walked, something moved behind me. Every time I stopped, it stopped. I decided to test it. Instead of turning around immediately, I stopped walking and just stood there on the trail, facing forward. The forest was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing. A few seconds passed, then 10 seconds, then maybe 15. Nothing happened. Slowly, I took one step forward, and another. After the third step, I heard it. One slow footstep behind me. The sound was unmistakable now, gravel shifting under weight, and it came from somewhere on the trail itself. I turned around quickly. The path behind me was empty. But now I knew the distance had changed. Whoever or whatever had been making those sounds wasn't far away anymore. They were close enough that I should have been able to see them if they were standing there. I stared down the trail for a long moment, scanning every shadow between the trees. Still nothing. Eventually I turned forward again and continued walking, but my pace had changed without me realizing it. My steps had become slower, more careful. Because now there was a thought sitting quietly in the back of my mind. Something out there wasn't just moving through the forest. It was matching my pace. By the time the forest started slipping toward dusk, I was walking a little faster than before. Not running, not panicking. Just moving with a steady pace that was a little quicker than the relaxed hike I'd started the day with. The trail ahead of me was still clear, winding through trees that were slowly turning darker as the sunlight faded. Behind me, the woods had gone quiet again. For several minutes, I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no gravel shifting, nothing moving through the brush. That almost made it worse, because after everything that had happened over the last mile, the silence felt temporary, like something was simply waiting for the right moment to move again. I tried focusing on the trail ahead, telling myself the same explanation I'd been repeating in my head for the last half hour. Probably an animal. Maybe a curious one that had been following at a distance. Eventually, it would lose interest. That made sense. Animals investigate things sometimes. They follow sense or movement, then wander away when nothing interesting happens. That was the version of the situation I wanted to believe. I had just started convincing myself of it again when it happened. Behind me, the forest suddenly exploded with movement. Footsteps, fast ones, not a single careful step like before. Multiple strides hitting the trail in quick succession. Running, the sound was loud enough that it echoed through the trees. Gravel scattering, branches shifting. The unmistakable rhythm of something sprinting directly toward me from behind. For a split second, my brain froze. Then instinct kicked in. I spun around immediately, expecting to see someone charging down the trail behind me. Maybe another hiker playing some kind of strange joke. Maybe someone trying to catch up after realizing they'd been spotted. But when I turned around, the trail behind me was empty. Completely empty. No person standing there. No animals sprinting through the brush. No branches still moving from something passing through them. Just the narrow dirt path stretching back through the trees, fading into dim shadows as evening settled into the forest. The running footsteps had stopped the exact moment I turned around. Not slowed. Not faded away. Stopped. Like someone had flipped a switch. For a few seconds I stood there staring down the trail, waiting for the person who must have made that noise to step into view. No one appeared. The forest stayed perfectly still. Even the wind seemed to have faded away. The strange part wasn't just that the trail was empty. It was how quickly the sound had vanished. Something had been running behind me, fast. Close enough that the gravel and dirt on the trail had shifted under its steps. But now there was nothing there. The quiet that followed felt heavier than anything I'd heard all day. I stood there on the trail longer than I probably should have. At first I kept expecting something to appear. A person stepping out from behind a tree, an animal darting across the path, some kind of explanation that would connect the sound I had just heard to something visible. But nothing moved. The forest stayed completely still, the same way it had every other time I turned around. Eventually I forced myself to take a breath and look away from the empty trail behind me, because the longer I stared at it, the more my thoughts started drifting in directions that didn't help anything. I reminded myself that the wilderness is full of sounds that don't always make sense right away. Animals react to human movement in strange ways sometimes. If something had been moving through the brush behind me, maybe a deer or even a fox, it could have panicked when I stopped and suddenly turned around. Animals bolt when they get startled. They run hard for a few seconds, then freeze once they think they're out of sight. That explanation wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to hold on to. And out there, holding on to the simplest explanation is usually the smartest thing you can do. So I turned back toward the direction of the trailhead and started walking again. My pace was steadier now, but the relaxed rhythm from earlier in the day was gone. Every few steps I caught myself listening again, waiting for another sound to come from behind me. The forest had grown darker while I stood there. The last of the sunlight had faded behind the trees, leaving the trail covered in that dim gray light that comes just before evening fully settles in. The path ahead was still visible, but the deeper parts of the woods on either side had turned into thick shadows. I kept moving forward, step after step, trying to focus on the trail itself instead of the forest around it. Every so often the uncomfortable thought returned, that quiet feeling that someone might still be out there somewhere behind me, watching, matching my movement through the trees. Each time that thought crept in, I pushed it away and repeated the explanation again. Probably animals, maybe more than one of them, reacting to the sound of my footsteps. That was the version of the situation I stuck with as I continued down the trail. Even though a small part of my mind kept noticing something difficult to ignore, no matter how far I walked, the forest behind me never sounded completely empty. And no matter how hard I tried to focus on the trail ahead, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something out there was still keeping pace with me. By the time I started recognizing the landmarks near the trailhead, the forest had already slipped into that dim, early evening light where everything starts looking flatter and harder to read. I knew I was close. There was a particular bend in the trail about 10 minutes from the parking area where the trees thin out a little and the ground becomes more gravel than dirt. I had passed that spot earlier in the day, and seeing it again gave me a quiet sense of relief. Whatever had been happening on the trail, it was almost over. As I reached the car, the whole thing would probably feel a lot less strange, so I kept walking. The sounds behind me had stopped again, and the forest had settled back into that same quiet atmosphere it had most of the afternoon. Just wind moving lightly through branches and the occasional distant bird somewhere deeper in the trees. Nothing following me, at least nothing I could hear. When I reached the gravel stretch of the trail, I slowed down slightly. Loose gravel makes a very specific sound under your boots, and it also shows footprints clearly for a short time before wind or movement disturbs them. Without really thinking about it, I glanced down at the ground. My own tracks were there, just like you'd expect. A steady line of boot prints leading back toward the trailhead from the direction I'd come earlier. But then something else caught my attention. Beside my footprints, there was another set. They weren't older prints that had been there earlier in the day. They were fresh. The impressions were sharp in the gravel, the edges still clean and undisturbed. Boot prints. Walking in the same direction I was. For a second I just stood there staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I crouched down a little closer. The pattern was obvious once I looked carefully. 2 sets of tracks moving side by side down the trail. Mine and someone else's. What made it strange wasn't just that they were there. It was how closely they matched my path. Every time my boot had stepped forward, the second set of prints appeared somewhere nearby beside it, sometimes slightly behind mine, sometimes slightly ahead, but always there, like whoever made them had been walking the same trail at the exact same time I had. I slowly turned around and looked back down the path behind me. The gravel stretch extended for maybe 30 or 40 feet before the trail turned back into packed dirt and pine needles. In that entire visible section of the path, the same pattern repeated. 2 sets of footprints, mine and another pair that followed the entire distance. The strange part was that I knew those prints hadn't been there earlier. When I first passed through that section of trail hours before, I would have noticed another set of fresh tracks, especially ones walking right beside mine. But somehow they had appeared during the hike back. I stood there for a while, looking from the prints on the ground to the quiet forest behind me. No movement, no sound of someone approaching, no sign of another hiker anywhere on the trail. Eventually I stood up again and continued the last stretch toward the parking area. I never saw anyone else on that trail. Not that evening, not anywhere along the road back toward town. Even when I reached the trailhead, the small parking area still held the same vehicles that had been there earlier in the day. No new ones. To this day, I can't fully explain those footprints. All I know is that when I looked down at that gravel trail near the end of the hike, there were 2 sets of tracks leading back toward the trailhead, mine and someone else's. And the truth is, I never once saw who made them. Transition, one thing that becomes clear after spending enough time in the wilderness is that danger doesn't always show itself directly. People often imagine dramatic encounters when they think about scary experiences outdoors. Something chasing you, something stepping out into the open where you can see it clearly. But that's not usually how it happens. Sometimes the most unsettling moments are the ones where you never actually see what caused them. You just notice the effects. A sound in the wrong place. Movement that stops the moment you look toward it. Footprints that appear where nothing should have been walking. Places like Alaska make those moments even harder to explain. The landscape is enormous, and the terrain hides things easily. Dense forest, deep valleys, uneven ground, and miles of wilderness where someone or something can move without ever being seen. It doesn't take much for a person to disappear out there. And sometimes it doesn't take much for someone to be nearby without you realizing it. That's what makes certain wilderness experiences stay with people long after they're over. Because the unsettling part isn't always what someone saw. It's the moment they realize they might not have been alone after all. Sometimes the scariest experiences in the wilderness happen when you're certain you're alone. And then you realize that might not be true. Story 3, the cabin lights a few winters ago. I took a temporary maintenance job that placed me in one of the most remote places I've ever lived. It was a small research cabin deep in the Alaskan backcountry, several hours away from the nearest town by snowmobile. The cabin itself belonged to a university research program that studied environmental changes in the area. During the summer, scientists would occasionally come out there to collect data, but during the winter months, the place mostly sat empty. My job was simple. Every few weeks, someone needed to go out there and make sure the building stayed operational. Check the generator, keep the heating system running, clear snow from certain areas of the structure, and make sure wildlife hadn't damaged anything. It wasn't complicated work, so mostly it was just routine maintenance and long stretches of being alone. Out along a series of marked winter trails that wound through forests and across frozen terrain. The trip usually took a few hours depending on the weather. Once you passed a certain point, the signs of civilization disappeared almost completely. No power lines, no other buildings. Just endless snow-covered forests stretching in every direction. When I arrived the first time, the cabin looked exactly like I expected. A simple wooden structure sitting in a small clearing, surrounded by tall, dark trees. Snow had piled up along the sides of the building, and the windows were half covered with frost from the cold. Inside, the place was basic, but comfortable enough. A small kitchen area, a couple of bunks, a desk with research equipment, and the generator room attached off the back of the structure. The heating system ran off a fuel supply that had to be monitored regularly. But once everything was running properly, the cabin stayed warm enough to live in. The first few days out there were quiet in the way remote places often are. During the daytime, I would take care of whatever tasks needed attention around the cabin. Clearing snow, checking equipment, walking short distances into the surrounding area to inspect weather monitoring devices that had been installed in the forest. After that, there wasn't much else to do. No cell service, no internet. Just books, a radio for emergencies, and the sound of wind moving across the frozen landscape outside. At night, the wilderness around the cabin became even quieter. Winter in Alaska has a way of creating a kind of silence that feels heavier than the quiet you hear in summer forests. Snow absorbs sound, and the thick trees around the clearing blocked most of the wind. Most evenings, I would finish dinner, check the generator one last time, and then sit by the window for a while before turning in. From inside the cabin, you could see the tree line clearly, a dark wall of forest surrounding the clearing on all sides. Beyond that, nothing but miles of wilderness. At first, the isolation felt almost peaceful. There's something calming about being in a place where the outside world can't reach you easily. No traffic, no distant city noise, no constant stream of people passing by. Just quiet. The kind of quiet where the loudest sound most nights was the soft hum of the generator behind the cabin. The first week passed without anything unusual happening. Each day followed the same basic rhythm. Wake up, check equipment, perform maintenance tasks, cook meals, and spend long quiet hours reading or writing notes while the winter darkness settled outside. I slept well during those nights, better than I usually do back in town. The cabin felt secure enough, and the clearing around it gave a clear view of anything that might approach through the trees. At least that's what I believed during those first few days, because at that point, I had no reason to think the forest around the cabin was anything other than empty. And during the day, it looked exactly that way. Just snow-covered ground stretching out toward the edge of the clearing, with dark silent trees standing beyond it. But sometime during the second week out there, something small happened one night while I was sitting near the window. At first, it didn't seem important enough to think about for more than a few seconds. Just a brief flicker of light between the trees. It's the kind of thing you might easily dismiss if you weren't paying close attention. At the time, I assumed it was probably nothing. At first, I didn't think much about the light. It happened late one evening while I was sitting at the small table near the window, reading. The generator hummed quietly behind the cabin, and outside the clearing the forest had already settled into that deep winter darkness where the snow almost glows faintly under the moon. I happened to glance up from the page for a second, and that's when I saw it. It's just a quick flicker of light moving somewhere between the trees beyond the clearing. It wasn't bright. More like a narrow beam that appeared for a moment and then disappeared again, like someone turning their flashlight slightly while walking through the forest. My first thought was simple. Hunters. Even in winter, people move through those areas occasionally. Snowmobilers travel long distances across backcountry trails, and sometimes hunters set up temporary camps in remote spots. So I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked toward the tree line again, expecting to see the light reappear. For a while, nothing happened. Then a few seconds later, the faint glow returned again, briefly passing between two dark trunks before vanishing. It looked exactly like someone walking through the woods with a flashlight. The strange part was how far away it seemed. However it was, had to be deeper in the forest, well beyond the edge of the clearing surrounding the cabin. I couldn't hear an engine or the sound of a snowmobile moving through the snow, but distance in that landscape can be deceptive. Sound doesn't always travel the way you expect it to. So I shrugged it off and went back to reading. It happened again the next night, and then once more a couple nights after that. This time it was the same thing. Faint moving light, appearing somewhere between the trees for a few seconds before disappearing again. Sometimes it looked like it was moving slowly. Other times it just flickered briefly and vanished before I could track exactly where it had been. Every time I saw it, the same explanation came to mind. Someone passing through the area, maybe hunters moving between camps, maybe someone on a snowmobile traveling along a route that ran deeper in the forest where I couldn't see the trail. The cabin was remote, but it wasn't impossible for other people to be out there. And honestly, the idea of someone else being somewhere out in that massive stretch of wilderness felt slightly comforting at first. It meant the area wasn't completely empty. Still, after a few nights of noticing the lights appear and disappear between the trees, I started paying a little closer attention whenever I sat near the window after dark. Because the more I watched the forest, the more I realized something about those lights felt slightly unusual. They never stayed visible for very long. They always disappeared the moment I tried to look directly at them. At first, I only noticed the lights when I happened to glance up from whatever I was doing inside the cabin. A brief flicker between the trees, then darkness again. But after a few nights of seeing them, I started watching the forest a little more carefully. That's when I realized something that didn't quite line up with the explanation I'd been using. There weren't any trails in the direction where the lights appeared. Before taking the job, I'd been given a detailed map of the surrounding area. Most of the winter routes and snowmobile paths were marked clearly, and the closest one passed several miles away from the cabin. The lights I was seeing weren't anywhere near that route. In fact, the direction they appeared from was mostly untouched forest. No marked trails, no research equipment sites, nothing that would normally attract people traveling through the area. Still, I tried not to overthink it. People move through wilderness in unpredictable ways sometimes. Hunters cut across terrain, snowmobilers explore new paths, and sometimes locals know routes that never show up on official maps. But then another detail started bothering me. Every time I saw the light from inside the cabin, I would eventually stand up and step outside onto the small porch to see if I could spot it again more clearly. And every single time I did that, the light disappeared, not slowly fading away, not moving deeper into the forest. Just gone. The first time it happened, I assumed whoever was out there had simply moved behind thicker trees, but it kept happening. I would see the faint beam flickering between trunks while sitting inside the cabin window. Then I'd step outside, stand there in the cold air, and scan the forest carefully. Nothing, no light, no sound of movement through the snow. No distant engine or human voices. Just the silent tree lines surrounding the clearing. At first I told myself it might be something simple like reflections. Sometimes moonlight bouncing off snow can create strange flashes through branches if the wind moves the trees just right. But that explanation didn't quite fit either, because what I was seeing looked deliberate. Narrow beam of light moving slowly through the forest. The kind of movement that usually comes from someone walking and turning their flashlight. After about the fourth or fifth time it happened, I started noticing something else. The lights never appeared while I was outside already. Only when I was inside the cabin looking out. The moment I stepped into the clearing to check the forest directly, they were gone. And after a while, that pattern started feeling a little too consistent to ignore. After that first week, the lights became something I started expecting. Not every night, but often enough that they stopped feeling like a one-time coincidence. Most evenings followed the same quiet routine. I would finish whatever maintenance tasks needed to be done, cook something simple for dinner, and then sit near the table with a book while the generator hummed quietly behind the cabin. Outside, the clearing stayed still under the snow, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the forest waited in complete darkness. At first I only noticed the lights occasionally, a brief flicker between trunks, appearing for a second or two before disappearing again. But once I started paying attention, I realized they were showing up more often than I thought. Some nights the glow appeared deeper in the trees, barely visible through the branches. Other nights it seemed closer to the edge of the clearing, never inside the open space around the cabin, but close enough that I could see the beam moving faintly through gaps between the trees. The strange thing was that the distance kept changing. One evening the light would appear far back in the forest, almost too faint to track. The next night it might show up somewhere much closer, drifting slowly between trunks before vanishing again. After a while I started questioning my own assumptions. Maybe it wasn't a person out there after all. The cabin windows were old, and sometimes reflections can create strange visual effects when there's light inside and darkness outside. The generator room also had a few indicator lights that glowed faintly at night. It was possible the flickers I was seeing were just reflections shifting across the glass. So one night I tested that idea. I turned off the interior lights in the cabin and sat quietly near the window for a while, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness outside. For several minutes nothing appeared. Then, just as I started thinking the reflection theory might actually be correct, the light showed up again. A faint beam drifting slowly between two trees, somewhere beyond the clearing. This time the cabin was completely dark. No interior light reflecting off the glass, and the beam still moved. I sat there watching it carefully, trying to figure out exactly what it was doing. For a few seconds it slid behind a tree trunk, then reappeared slightly farther to the side, before disappearing again into the forest. Not flickering randomly, moving. That was the moment I started realizing something about the pattern. The lights weren't just showing up occasionally. They were returning, night after night, and each time they appeared, they seemed to move slightly differently through the trees, sometimes farther away, sometimes closer, but always out there somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin. And no matter how long I watched the forest, I never once saw the person or thing holding the light. For a while, the lights stayed at a distance, far enough back in the forest that I could convince myself they weren't really connected to the cabin at all, just someone moving through the wilderness somewhere beyond the clearing. But one night that changed. I remember it clearly because the weather had turned especially cold that evening. The kind of deep winter cold where the air outside looks almost perfectly still, and every sound seems sharper because nothing is moving to carry it away. I had just finished checking the generator and stepped back inside the cabin. The heater was running steadily. I poured myself a cup of coffee before sitting down near the window like I usually did before turning in for the night. The clearing outside looked the same as always, snow stretching across the open space, the dark tree lines surrounding it on all sides. For a while I just sat there quietly, not really expecting anything unusual. Then the light appeared again. But this time it wasn't deep in the forest. It was closer, much closer than I had ever seen it before. At first it flickered between two trees just beyond the edge of the clearing, a narrow beam of light moving slowly as if someone were walking carefully through the woods. I leaned forward slightly in my chair, trying to get a better look without getting up. The light moved again, not quickly, just a small shift to the side, disappearing briefly behind a trunk before sliding into view again. It was definitely coming from somewhere just inside the tree line, maybe 20 or 30 yards from the cabin, close enough that if someone stepped out of the forest, they would be standing right at the edge of the clearing. For several minutes, I watched it move slowly between the trees. The beam wasn't sweeping wildly like someone searching for something. Instead, it drifted gently from one spot to another, pausing for a moment before shifting again. Almost like someone walking slowly through the forest and occasionally lowering their flashlight. I remember noticing how careful the movement looked. Deliberate. Quiet. The strange part was that I couldn't hear anything at all. No footsteps crunching through snow. No branches shifting. No distant engine noise. It's just the steady hum of the generator and the faint creak of the cabin walls settling in the cold. Eventually, the light stopped moving for a few seconds. It hovered in one place between the trees, partially blocked by branches. And for the first time since I'd started seeing the lights out there, I realized how close it actually was to the cabin. Close enough that whoever was holding it would have been able to see the building clearly through the trees. Close enough to know someone was inside. For a few minutes I stayed exactly where I was, sitting at the table and watching the light through the window. It didn't move very much at first, just small shifts, like someone adjusting their grip on a flashlight while walking slowly between trees. The beam would slide behind a trunk, disappear for a second, then reappear slightly to the side again. But eventually that movement stopped. The light held in one place, just inside the tree line. I waited for it to move again. A few seconds passed, then maybe a minute. Still nothing. At first I thought maybe the person out there had simply paused for a moment. Maybe they were adjusting something, or looking down at the ground, or checking their path before continuing deeper into the forest. But the longer I watched, the stranger it started to feel. The beam wasn't drifting anymore. It wasn't scanning the ground or shifting between trees. It was fixed, completely still. I leaned forward slightly and narrowed my eyes, trying to see past the branches that partially blocked the view. That's when I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The light wasn't pointing downward the way someone walking through snow usually holds a flashlight. It wasn't angled toward the ground. It wasn't moving across the trees. It was pointed directly toward the clearing, toward the cabin. For a moment I told myself that could still be normal. Someone might have stopped to look at the building after noticing it through the trees. But the longer I sat there watching, the more something about the scene began to feel wrong. Because the light wasn't shifting at all. Not even slightly. No movement.
Oh.
No sign of someone adjusting their grip or turning their head. Just a steady beam shining from the forest toward the cabin windows. And then slowly, another realization settled in. There wasn't just one light, there were two. At first, they had looked like one beam moving through the trees, but now that the movement had stopped, I could see them more clearly between the branches. Two faint points of light, close together, holding perfectly still in the darkness, both facing directly toward the cabin.
Right.
For a moment, I just sat there staring at the two faint lights between the trees, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My first reaction wasn't panic. It was the same thing that happens in most strange situations out in the wilderness. My brain immediately started searching for a normal explanation. People, that had to be it. Maybe hikers passing through the area. Be someone traveling by snowmobile who had stopped near the tree line to check something. Even though I hadn't heard an engine earlier, sound can travel strangely through dense forest and snow. And the lights themselves weren't bright enough to look like vehicle headlights. Flashlights made more sense. Two people standing just inside the trees, looking toward the clearing after noticing the cabin. That explanation felt reasonable enough to settle on. Still, something about the way the lights held perfectly still bothered me. Normally, when someone is holding a flashlight, the beam shifts a little without them realizing it. Hands move slightly. The light wobbles or drifts across the ground. But these two lights weren't moving at all, so I decided to test something. If there really were people out there looking toward the cabin, they were probably seeing the glow from the windows. The interior lights made the cabin stand out clearly against the darkness. Anyone standing in the forest would immediately notice it. I stood up from the table and walked over to the switch near the wall. Then I turned the cabin lights off. The room dropped into darkness instantly, leaving only the faint moonlight filtering through the window. For a few seconds, I stayed where I was, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. Then I moved slowly back toward the window and looked out again. The two lights were still there between the trees, still perfectly still, still facing the cabin. Now that the interior lights were off, whoever was out there wouldn't be able to see inside clearly anymore. Which meant if they were just curious hikers passing through, they would probably move on once the cabin went dark. So I stayed quiet and waited, watching the forest, waiting for the lights to shift, or turn away, or disappear back into the trees. But they didn't. I stood there in the dark cabin watching the forest for a long time. At first, I expected the lights to move the moment the cabin went dark. If they really were hikers or someone passing through the area, turning off the interior lights should have made the building less interesting. Without the glow from the windows, the clearing would just look like another dark patch in the snow. But the lights didn't move, stayed there between the trees, to faint points of light holding perfectly still in the darkness. After a while, I stepped back from the window and waited near the table, giving my eyes time to adjust to the dim light inside the cabin. The heater hummed quietly, and the wind outside shifted snow softly against the walls. Maybe 10 minutes passed, then 20. Eventually, I walked back to the window and looked out again. The forest was completely dark. The lights were gone. At first, I thought maybe they had simply turned their flashlights off. Whoever had been standing out there might have realized the cabin had gone dark and decided to move away quietly. That explanation made sense. And once the lights disappeared, the forest returned to the same still silence it had every other night. No movement. No sound. Eventually, I went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early and stepped outside to check the generator like I normally did. The cold air hit immediately, and the clearing looked peaceful again under the pale winter sunlight. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then, I noticed the footprints. They were everywhere in the snow around the cabin, multiple sets. Boot prints pressed clearly into the fresh snow, leading from the tree line straight across the clearing toward the building. Some of them stopped near the windows. Others circled around the walls of the cabin, close enough that whoever made them could have looked directly inside. I stood there, slowly turning in place, following the tracks with my eyes. They came from the forest, across the clearing, right up to the cabin. But the longer I looked, the more something about the pattern didn't make sense, because there were no footprints leading back. None. Just tracks coming from the trees, stopping around the walls of the cabin. And nowhere in the snow was there a trail showing where they had gone afterward. Final closing: when people think about frightening experiences, they usually imagine something dramatic, something sudden. It's a clear moment where danger appears, and the situation resolves one way or another. But the stories that stay with people the longest rarely work like that, especially in places like Alaska. In cities, strange moments tend to have explanations waiting nearby. A sound in the hallway turns out to be a neighbor. Footsteps outside the building belong to someone passing by. Even when something feels unsettling at first, there are usually enough people and activity around that the answer eventually reveals itself. The wilderness doesn't work that way. Out there, distance changes how you understand things. When you're hundreds of miles from the nearest town, surrounded by forests, mountains, or frozen terrain, there aren't many easy explanations available. If something unusual happens, there might not be another person nearby to confirm what you saw or heard. Sometimes there isn't even anyone close enough to compare the experience with afterward. That's why small details begin to matter more. A sound that doesn't match the environment. It's a movement where nothing should be moving. Footprint appearing somewhere it shouldn't exist. Or the quiet realization that someone else might be nearby, even though the land around you is supposed to be completely empty. The three people in these stories all walked away safely. Nothing chased them. Nothing attacked them. In the moment, each situation probably seemed manageable. Something strange, maybe even uncomfortable, but not immediately dangerous. But the reason those experiences stayed with them is because none of them ever received a clear explanation. The hiker who woke up to footsteps circling their tent never learned who had been walking around their campsite that night. The photographer who heard something matching their pace along the trail never saw who left those second set of footprints beside their own. And the worker alone in the research cabin never discovered why multiple sets of tracks led up to the walls of the building, without a single set leading away. Each story ended the same way. The person eventually returned home. Life moved forward. But the question stayed behind. Because the wilderness doesn't always provide answers. Sometimes it simply absorbs the moment and leaves you with the memory of it. And the strange thing about experiences like that is how quietly they settle into your thoughts over time. You replay them in your mind occasionally, trying to find the logical explanation you might have missed, trying to convince yourself that there must have been something simple behind it all. But sometimes the details refuse to line up perfectly, and that's when the thought begins to linger. Maybe you didn't imagine it. Maybe something really was out there, watching, moving, standing somewhere just beyond the edge of what you could see. Because the worst part about stories like these isn't what the people experienced in the wilderness. It's the fact that the wilderness never explained it.